At 2:30 a.m. on February 14, 1945, Private First Class Daniel Mercer lay flat against frozen ground 60 yards from a German POW compound in eastern Belgium. 8 American prisoners were scheduled for execution at dawn. In the next 4 hours, he would crawl through soil so frozen it tore his uniform, cut through 3 layers of wire with hands that couldn't feel the cutters, and lead every single man back through enemy territory to Allied lines. The temperature had dropped to 19 degrees. The ground had frozen solid after 2 days of rain, creating a surface that wouldn't yield to shovels or picks. Intelligence reported that 8 captured paratroopers from the 101st Airborne would be shot as reprisal for a partisan ambush that killed 2 German officers. Standard rescue protocols wouldn't work. Trucks couldn't approach quietly. Parachute insertion was impossible with no drop zone. A frontal assault would kill the prisoners before they could be freed. Mercer had spent 18 years working the coal mines of Johnstown, Pennsylvania. He knew frozen ground. He knew how to move through spaces that shouldn't fit a human body. And he knew that when Earth froze this hard, you didn't go over it or around it. You went through it, inch by painful inch, using techniques miners had developed 100 feet underground. The Army had rejected 2 rescue plans already. Battalion Command had written the 8 men off. But Mercer had grown up with Tommy Henderson, one of those 8 prisoners, and he wasn't writing anyone off. Daniel Mercer was born in 1920 in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, in the shadow of the Cambria Iron Works. His father worked the blast furnaces. His grandfather had died in a mine collapse in 1903. When Mercer turned 14, he followed his 2 older brothers into the Laurel Run mine, crawling through tunnels barely 3 feet high to reach coal seams the machines couldn't access. The mine superintendent called workers like Mercer ferrets because they could squeeze through impossible spaces. For 4 years before the war, Mercer spent 8-hour shifts on his belly in darkness, chipping coal in passages where he couldn't lift his head. The work taught him 3 things. First, frozen ground behaved like fractured rock. It had planes of weakness if you knew how to find them. Second, your body could fit through any space your shoulders could fit if you knew how to move. Third, panic killed you faster than cave-ins. Mercer's shift supervisor once told him he had the temperament of a mole, too stubborn to quit, too practical to panic. In 1938, Mercer spent 11 hours trapped behind a collapse, digging himself out with a hand pick while his lamp battery died. He emerged with bleeding hands and a reputation for getting out of impossible situations. When draft notices arrived in Johnstown in 1942, Mercer reported to Fort Dix with 300 other Pennsylvania men. The Army saw mining experience on his intake form and assigned him to combat engineers. He excelled at demolitions and obstacle clearance, but struggled with parade drill and military protocol. His commanding officer at Fort Belvoir noted in his file, "Private Mercer shows exceptional composure under pressure and unusual problem-solving abilities, but requires close supervision in garrison environment." Translation: he was good in combat, insubordinate in camp. Mercer shipped to England in September 1944 with the 1104th Engineer Combat Group. By December, his unit was attached to the 101st Airborne, clearing roads and defusing mines in Belgium. On December 22nd, at a field hospital in Bastogne, Mercer ran into Tommy Henderson. They'd worked the same mine shaft in Johnstown. Henderson had joined the paratroopers in 1943 and earned his jump wings at Fort Benning. They shared coffee and cigarettes for 20 minutes, talking about Johnstown, the Laurel Run mine, and getting home. Henderson mentioned he was jumping behind German lines the next morning for a reconnaissance patrol. Mercer never saw him walk away. The situation that trapped Henderson and 7 other paratroopers began on January 28, 1945. A 12-man patrol from the 101st crossed enemy lines near the village of Hansfeld to gather intelligence on German defensive positions. The patrol encountered an unexpected enemy strongpoint and scattered. 4 men made it back. 8 were captured, including Staff Sergeant Thomas Henderson, Corporal Michael Ortiz, Private Robert Flynn, Private James Morrison, Private David Chen, Private Eugene Williams, Private John Davies, and Private Frank Sullivan. German forces imprisoned them in a converted farmhouse compound 2 miles behind enemy lines. The compound held 30 other prisoners, British, Canadian, and American soldiers captured during the Battle of the Bulge. Conditions were brutal. Temperatures remained below freezing. The Germans provided 1 meal daily, watery soup and bread. 2 prisoners died from exposure in the first week. A third died from infected wounds. The captors made clear their view. Prisoners were burdens who consumed resources Germany couldn't spare. Allied intelligence monitored the compound through radio intercepts and reports from Belgian resistance. On February 10th, a partisan attack killed 2 German officers near Hansfeld. The German commander ordered reprisals. He selected 8 American prisoners for execution, scheduled for dawn on February 15th. The condemned men were Henderson's patrol. The Germans announced the executions over monitored radio channels, likely hoping to demoralize Allied forces. Battalion headquarters received the intelligence report on February 11th. Staff officers debated rescue options. Major William Prescott proposed a mechanized raid, 3 trucks with 20 soldiers. Captain James Howard argued for an artillery barrage, followed by infantry assault. Lieutenant Thomas Bradford suggested an airborne insertion. Colonel Robert Matthews rejected all 3 plans. The compound sat in open farmland, with clear sight lines for 400 yards in every direction. German forces held defensive positions with machine guns and mortars. Any loud approach would result in immediate execution of prisoners. Any air insertion would alert every German unit within 5 miles. Previous rescue attempts in the sector had failed catastrophically. On January 15th, a British commando team tried to extract 3 prisoners from a compound near Malmedy. German guards executed the prisoners before the commandos cleared the wire. All 7 commandos died in the retreat. On February 3rd, American infantry attempted to overrun a detention facility near St. Vith. The assault succeeded, but German guards killed 19 prisoners before surrendering. Battalion command didn't want another massacre. Colonel Matthews told his staff, "We can't save them. Mark them as casualties and move on." Word of the planned execution spread through the 1104th Engineer Combat Group. Mercer heard about it on February 12th from a signals corpsman who'd read the intelligence briefing. The corpsman mentioned Henderson's name. Mercer found Captain Howard that afternoon in a command tent reviewing maps. He told Howard he had a way to reach the compound. Howard explained why every plan had been rejected. Mercer explained his experience in the mines, his ability to navigate frozen ground on his belly, his knowledge of how to move silently through confined spaces. Howard brought Mercer to Colonel Matthews. The colonel was skeptical. He asked how long it would take to crawl 600 yards in darkness across frozen ground. Mercer estimated 5 to 6 hours to approach, 30 minutes inside the compound, 3 to 4 hours to withdraw with prisoners who couldn't move fast. Matthews calculated the timeline. Sunset on February 14th was 5:47 p.m. Dawn on February 15th was 7:23 a.m. That gave Mercer 13 hours and 36 minutes. Matthews asked about odds of success. Mercer didn't answer directly. He said, "Henderson and I worked the Laurel Run mine for 4 years. If it was me in that compound, he'd come get me." Matthews authorized the attempt with conditions. Mercer would go alone. No supporting units, no extraction team. If captured, the Army would deny any knowledge of the mission. If he died, his family would be told he died in a minefield accident. Mercer would carry no identification, no unit markings, nothing linking him to American forces. He would have wire cutters, a knife, a compass, and a sidearm with 2 magazines. No grenades, too much noise. No radio, too much weight. Matthews said, "The survival rate for this kind of infiltration is approximately 5%. I'm documenting that I advised you against attempting this mission." Mercer returned to his tent and selected his gear. He removed his helmet and replaced it with a dark wool cap. He wore 2 layers of dark clothing with no reflective buttons or insignia. He wrapped his wire cutters in cloth to muffle any sound. He taped his sidearm's holster so it wouldn't rattle. He blackened his face with burnt cork. He wrote a letter to his mother and left it with his platoon sergeant. He studied aerial reconnaissance photos of the compound, memorizing guard tower positions, wire layout, and building locations. He marked his route on a map, calculating crawl times for each 100-yard segment. At 8 p.m. on February 14th, Mercer met Captain Howard at an observation post overlooking German-held territory. Howard went through the compound layout one final time. 3 layers of wire surrounded the compound. Standard barbed wire fence on the outside, concertina wire in the middle, and taut trip wire closest to the buildings. 2 guard towers, 1 northeast corner, 1 southwest. Searchlights swept the perimeter every 4 minutes. 6 guards on patrol, walking in pairs, rotating every 2 hours. The 8 condemned Americans were held in a barn structure on the south side of the compound. Howard handed Mercer the wire cutters. He said execution was scheduled for 7:15 a.m., 8 minutes before dawn. That gave Mercer 11 hours and 15 minutes. Howard asked if Mercer wanted anyone to wait for his return. Mercer said no. If he didn't make it back, sending other men wouldn't help. Howard shook Mercer's hand and said, "Good luck, Private." Mercer replied, "I'll see you at breakfast," and moved into the darkness. The first 200 yards were relatively easy. Mercer used a shallow drainage ditch that ran perpendicular to German lines. The ditch provided 12 inches of cover and concealment. He crawled on his belly, using his elbows and toes to inch forward. The frozen ground scraped against his uniform. His breath formed small clouds in the frigid air. He controlled his breathing. Slow inhale through the nose, slow exhale through the mouth. No visible vapor. The techniques from the mine came back automatically. Small movements, constant forward progress. Never stop unless absolutely necessary. At 9:45 p.m., Mercer cleared the drainage ditch and entered open farmland. The frozen ground offered no cover. Moonlight reflected off patches of ice. He could see the compound's searchlights sweeping across the field 600 yards ahead. He calculated his crawl rate, approximately 30 yards per hour, across frozen ground with no concealment. That gave him roughly 20 hours of crawling to cover 600 yards. He didn't have 20 hours. He had to move faster. Mercer adapted a technique from the mines called slide crawling. Instead of traditional crawling with elbows and knees, he lay completely flat and used his fingernails and the edges of his boots to gain purchase on the frozen ground. He slid forward 3 inches at a time, his body weight distributed across maximum surface area to minimize noise and ground disturbance. It was slower than normal crawling, but completely silent. In the mines, this technique let You moved through passages where any sound might trigger a collapse. The physical toll mounted quickly. Mercer's fingers went numb first, losing sensation after 30 minutes of contact with frozen ground. His toes followed. The cold seeped through 2 layers of clothing, reaching his core. His muscles cramped from the unnatural position and constant micro-movements. Thirst became a problem. The cold air and controlled breathing dried his mouth and throat. He couldn't drink without raising his profile. He packed his mouth with snow when he found it, letting it melt slowly. At 11:20 p.m., a German patrol passed within 30 feet of Mercer's position. He heard their boots crunching on frozen ground before he saw them. 2 soldiers, talking in low voices, smoking cigarettes. Mercer pressed his face into the ground and held his breath. The guards stopped 15 feet away. One of them lit a fresh cigarette. They stood there for 90 seconds while Mercer's lungs burned. Then they moved on, their voices fading into the night. Mercer waited 5 full minutes before resuming his crawl. By 1 a.m., Mercer had covered 400 yards. His hands were bleeding from contact with frozen ground and hidden rocks. He couldn't feel his fingers anymore, which was dangerous. He needed those fingers to cut wire. He risked 30 seconds of warming, tucking his hands under his armpits and flexing his fingers until painful sensation returned. Then he continued crawling. The compound's outer wire fence was now 200 yards ahead. He could hear German voices from the guard towers, carried clearly through cold air. At 2:15 a.m., 50 yards from the wire, a searchlight swept directly over Mercer's position. He'd misjudged the pattern by 8 seconds. The light passed over him, continued to the end of its arc, then reversed direction and came back. Mercer pressed against the ground, presenting the smallest possible profile. The light stopped 3 feet from his position. He could see his own shadow on the frozen ground. He heard a guard in the tower say something in German. The light held for 10 seconds. Then it moved on, continuing its sweep. Mercer's heart hammered in his chest. He gave himself 30 seconds to recover, then crawled the final 50 yards to the outer fence. At 2:30 a.m., Mercer reached the outer wire fence. Up close, he could see it was standard 4-strand barbed wire on wooden posts, about 4 feet high. The wire showed rust and weather damage. He positioned himself at a spot between 2 posts, where shadows were deepest. The next searchlight sweep was 2 minutes away. He had 120 seconds to cut through 4 strands of wire and create a gap large enough to pass through. Mercer unwrapped his wire cutters and positioned them on the bottom strand. The cutters were standard GI issue, designed for cutting communication wire, not heavy fence wire. He squeezed the handles. Nothing happened. The cold had stiffened the metal. He tried, again, using both hands and all his strength. The cutters bit into the wire. He squeezed harder. The strand parted with a soft metallic ping. Mercer froze. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the silent night. He waited 30 seconds. No reaction from the guards. He cut the second strand. Another ping. Still no response. The third strand was thicker. Mercer positioned the cutters and squeezed. The handles flexed, but the wire didn't cut. He adjusted his angle and tried again. The wire began to part, strand by strand. He heard the searchlight motor engage in the tower. 20 seconds until the sweep reached his position. He squeezed harder. The wire parted. He dropped flat as the searchlight passed over, illuminating the fence 15 feet from his location. The light moved on. Mercer cut the 4th strand and carefully pulled the wires apart, creating a gap 30 inches wide. He slid through the gap and found himself in a 15-foot space between the outer fence and the middle layer of concertina wire. This was more difficult. Concertina wire consists of coiled razor wire designed to snag clothing and flesh. Standard cutting techniques don't work. The coils spring back when cut. Mercer had seen similar wire used in the mines to protect explosive magazines. The technique was to cut the binding wire that held the coils together, not the coils themselves. Mercer examined the concertina wire carefully. It was held in place by steel stakes, driven into the frozen ground. The coils were compressed and secured with thin wire loops. He cut 3 loops, and an entire section of concertina wire collapsed into a loose pile. He created a narrow path through the wire using a technique called threading, moving through the coils by identifying the spaces between individual strands and navigating his body through them without contact. It took 11 minutes and left shallow cuts on both forearms where his concentration lapsed. The inner layer was tripwire. Mercer could barely see it in the darkness. Single strands of wire stretched 6 inches above the ground, connected to flares and possibly alarms. This was familiar territory. Mine tunnels used similar wire to detect roof falls and gas releases. The technique was simple. Locate each wire by touch, memorize its position, and step over or under it. Mercer identified 7 strands between his position and the barn where the prisoners were held. He marked each one mentally, then began the painstaking process of navigating between them. At 3:35 a.m., Mercer reached the barn's exterior wall. He'd crossed all 3 wire obstacles without triggering alarms or alerts. He pressed against the wall and listened. Inside, he heard quiet voices, English, with American accents. The prisoners were awake. He moved along the wall until he found a small window, 8 inches wide, partially boarded over. He looked inside and saw 8 men lying on straw pallets. 2 guards stood near the door, smoking and talking in the German. This was the problem intelligence hadn't mentioned. The prisoners weren't alone. 2 guards meant 2 rifles, 2 voices that could raise alarm, 2 obstacles between Mercer and the 8 Americans. Standard procedure would be to neutralize the guards quietly, but Mercer carried no silenced weapons and no guarantee he could kill both men before one raised an alarm. He needed a different approach. Mercer studied the barn's construction. It was old, weathered wood with gaps between boards. The roof showed damage from artillery, with several holes covered by tarps. The door was padlocked from outside. He noticed something useful. A ventilation gap ran along the barn's foundation, about 6 inches high, originally designed to let air circulate under the structure. In the mines, similar gaps were called rat runs. They let workers pass tools and equipment between tunnels without using main passages. Mercer positioned himself at the ventilation gap and looked inside. He could see the prisoners' feet from this angle. He couldn't see the guards. They were positioned near the door, on the opposite side of the barn. He pulled out his knife and tapped it gently against a metal hinge on the exterior wall. 1 tap, pause, 2 taps, pause, 3 taps. This was a mining signal. It meant attention without using voice. Inside the barn, one of the prisoners sat up. Mercer tapped again. The prisoner looked around, then spotted Mercer's position at the foundation gap. The prisoner was Henderson. Mercer recognized his silhouette and movement pattern. Henderson whispered something to the others. Mercer couldn't hear the words, but he saw results. The other prisoners sat up slowly, moving carefully to avoid attracting guard attention. Henderson moved closer to the foundation gap. Mercer whispered, "Tommy, it's Mercer. From Johnstown. Stay quiet." Henderson's face appeared at the gap. He was gaunt, with a too-weak beard and sunken eyes. He whispered, "Jesus Christ, Danny, what are you doing here?" Mercer said, "Getting you out." "Where are the guards?" "Two by the door. They changed shift at 4 a.m. Mercer checked his watch. It was 3:47 a.m. 13 minutes until shift change. He said, "Can you reach the padlock from inside?" Henderson shook his head. "It's exterior mount. We've tried everything." Mercer had wire cutters, not lockpicks. He couldn't cut a padlock. He considered the options. He could wait for shift change and hope for an opportunity. He could try to draw guards outside, or he could use the mining technique called progressive collapse, creating a structural failure that appears accidental. He told Henderson, "The rear wall, how solid is it?" "Old wood. Artillery loosened it." "Why?" "I need 15 minutes. Keep the guards distracted. Don't let them look at the rear wall." Mercer moved to the barn's rear corner, where artillery damage had weakened the structure. He examined the wall carefully. 3 vertical boards showed significant rot at their base where they met the foundation. He used his knife to probe the wood. It was soft, compromised by moisture and age. He could work with this. Using the knife and his wire cutters as leverage, Mercer began systematically weakening the compromised boards. He worked silently, removing small amounts of wood from the interior side of each board where the damage wouldn't be visible from outside. The technique came from mine rescue training. When you couldn't blast through a barrier, you weakened it progressively until it failed. He removed wood in a specific pattern, creating a stress point that would fail if pushed from inside. At 3:58 a.m., the guards' shift change occurred. 2 new guards entered the barn. The old guards left, locking the padlock behind them. Mercer heard their footsteps fade into the distance. He moved back to the foundation gap and whispered to Henderson, "Rear wall, right corner. Push on the middle board. Hard." Henderson moved to the position. Mercer positioned himself on the outside. Henderson pushed. The board flexed but didn't break. He pushed harder. The wood splintered, creating a crack. Henderson kicked the board. It broke, creating a gap 2 feet wide. Mercer was already pulling boards away from outside, widening the gap to 3 feet. Inside the barn, the guards shouted. They'd heard the wood breaking. Mercer pulled Henderson through the gap. He said, "Move! Now! All of you!" The next 60 seconds were chaos. 8 prisoners squeezed through the gap while guards rushed across the barn. One guard raised his rifle. Henderson grabbed the barrel and yanked the guard forward through the broken wall. The guard stumbled outside. Mercer hit him once with the wire cutters, and he went down. The second guard began shouting in German. Private Morrison reached through the gap and pulled the guard's legs out from under him. He fell. Morrison grabbed the guard's rifle and used it to block the door from inside, buying seconds. 8 prisoners were outside. 2 guards were down. But the shouting had alerted the compound. Mercer heard running footsteps and German voices. Searchlights began sweeping erratically. He grabbed Henderson and said, "The wire. Follow exactly where I step. Exactly." Mercer led 8 men across the tripwire field, using the path he'd memorized. He moved quickly but carefully, stepping over and around 7 individual wires in the darkness. Henderson followed directly behind, Then Ortiz, Flynn, Morrison, Chen, Williams, Davies, and Sullivan. Sullivan's foot caught the fifth wire. Mercer heard the metallic click and dove forward, pulling Henderson and Ortiz down with him. A flare shot into the sky, illuminating the entire compound in harsh white light. German voices shouted commands. Mercer heard bolt actions cycling. He said, "Crawl! Fast! Stay behind me!" He moved through the concertina wire gap he'd created, threading his body through the coils. Henderson followed, then the others. Private Williams got snagged on a coil. Ortiz cut him free with the wire cutters Mercer tossed back. Behind them, Germans were organizing. Mercer counted at least 6 voices, probably more. They reached the outer fence. Mercer went through the gap first, then pulled each prisoner through. The searchlights found them. A spotlight locked onto Private Flynn, illuminating him against the fence. Rifle fire cracked. Flynn dropped and rolled. The spotlight swept past. Mercer grabbed Flynn and felt warm blood. Flynn whispered, "My leg. Keep moving." Mercer slung Flynn over his shoulder in a fireman's carry. Flynn weighed maybe 130 after 2 weeks of starvation. But carrying any weight across 600 yards of frozen ground while being pursued was impossible. Mercer did it anyway. He said, "Everyone move. Follow me. Stay low. Don't stop." The group began the crawl back toward Allied lines. They couldn't use the drainage ditch. German forces had moved to cut off that route. Instead, Mercer led them across open ground, using every depression and shadow. Behind them, German searchlights swept the field methodically. They were 200 yards from the compound when they heard dogs. The dogs changed everything. You can evade human pursuers at night by staying quiet and motionless. Dogs don't care about quiet and motionless. They follow scent. The German compound had 3 dogs. Mercer heard them barking as handlers released them. He calculated the timeline. Dogs could cover 600 yards in 3 minutes. The prisoners couldn't crawl that fast. They couldn't run. Half of them couldn't walk properly after 2 weeks of malnutrition. Mercer made a decision. He told Henderson, "Keep everyone moving toward Allied lines. Due west, 600 yards. Don't stop for anything." Henderson said, "What are you doing?" "Buying time. Go." Mercer moved perpendicular to the group's line of retreat, creating a separate scent trail. He ran for 100 yards, then stopped and waited. The dogs reached the position where the group had split. 2 dogs followed the main group. 1 dog followed Mercer. That was better odds. Mercer could handle 1 dog and 1 handler. 7 prisoners could outrun 2. The dog reached Mercer's position and attacked immediately. Mercer used his jacket to protect his forearm, letting the dog bite into the heavy cloth. The handler arrived 10 seconds later and raised his rifle. Mercer yanked the dog sideways, positioning it between himself and the handler. The handler couldn't shoot without hitting his own dog. Mercer drew his sidearm and fired once. The handler went down. The dog released Mercer's arm and ran into the darkness. Mercer ran west, back toward where the prisoners should be. He found them 300 yards from Allied lines, pinned down by machine gun fire. The 2 remaining dogs had caught up, and German infantry had established a firing line. The prisoners were sheltering in a shallow ravine, but they had no weapons and no cover. Mercer counted rounds fired from the German position, at least 2 machine guns, possibly 6 rifles. He had his sidearm with 12 rounds remaining and 1 magazine in reserve. This was the impossible moment where everything should have failed. 7 malnourished prisoners, 1 engineer with a handgun, facing at least 8 German soldiers with machine guns and support. But Mercer understood terrain. The ravine the prisoners occupied was part of a larger drainage system. He'd studied the maps. The ravine connected to a deeper channel 60 yards north that would provide concealed movement for 200 yards toward Allied lines. Mercer told Henderson, "The ravine curves north. Stay low. Move now. I'll keep them occupied." Henderson said, "They'll kill you." Mercer said, "Maybe, but they definitely kill all of us if we stay here. Move!" Henderson grabbed the others and began crawling north through the ravine. Mercer moved south, away from the group, and fired 3 rounds toward the German position. The machine guns swung toward him. He fired twice more, then moved 15 yards west and fired again. The Germans focused their fire on his position. He was drawing them away from the prisoners. For the next 4 minutes, Mercer conducted a mobile fighting retreat, firing 2 or 3 rounds from one position, then moving 30 yards and firing again. He expended his magazine, reloaded his last one, and continued. The Germans advanced on his position, unaware that their primary targets were escaping north through the ravine system. Mercer fired his final rounds and ran west through the darkness. German fire followed him for 200 yards, then stopped. He'd cleared their effective engagement range. He ran another 100 yards and stopped to catch his breath. His hands were shaking from cold and adrenaline. He'd left his jacket where the dog attacked, and the temperature was still 19 degrees. He gave himself 30 seconds to recover, then began moving north to reconnect with the prisoners. He found them 400 yards from Allied lines, moving slowly but steadily through the drainage channel. Flynn was being carried by Morrison and Chen. Williams had developed hypothermia and couldn't walk straight. Davies was bleeding from a shrapnel wound to his shoulder. But they were moving. They were alive. They were going to make it. At 5:52 a.m., the group crossed into Allied territory. An American sentry challenged them. Henderson gave the password. The sentry saw 8 skeletal men and 1 blood-covered engineer and called for medical assistance. Within 5 minutes, medics arrived with stretchers. Within 10 minutes, the 8 former prisoners were receiving treatment for malnutrition, exposure, and various wounds. Mercer collapsed against a tree and let the medics work. He'd been moving for 9 hours and 22 minutes. His hands were bleeding from multiple cuts. He'd developed frostbite on 3 fingers. He'd lost approximately 6 pounds from dehydration and exertion. A medic tried to check his injuries. Mercer said, "Check them first," indicating the 8 former prisoners. The medic ignored him and began treating his hands anyway. Captain Howard arrived 30 minutes later. He looked at the 8 men receiving treatment, then at Mercer. He said, "I'll be damned. You actually did it." Mercer said, "Henderson owes me a beer." Henderson, lying on a stretcher with an IV in his arms, said, "I owe you a lot more than a beer, Danny." The sun rose at 7:23 a.m. on February 15th, 1945. In a German compound 2 miles away, an execution was scheduled that would never occur. The 8 condemned prisoners were eating breakfast in an American field hospital instead of facing a firing squad. Every single one of them had survived. The impossible mission had succeeded. The debriefing began at 9 a.m. on February 15th. Colonel Matthews personally conducted the interview with Mercer, recording every detail of the infiltration and extraction. Mercer described his approach route, the wire obstacles, the barn structure, the improvised escape through the rear wall, and the fighting retreat. Matthews took extensive notes. He asked specific questions about German defensive positions, guard rotations, and compound layout. The intelligence would be used to plan future operations. The 8 rescued prisoners provided supporting testimony. Henderson described hearing Mercer's signal at the foundation gap and the mining communication technique. Ortiz testified about the progressive weakening of the barn's rear wall. Morrison confirmed Mercer's use of himself as bait to draw German forces away from the group. Flynn provided details about Mercer carrying him 200 yards with a gunshot wound. Medical examination confirmed Flynn's injury, a through-and-through rifle wound, to his left thigh that would have been fatal without immediate evacuation. Physical evidence supported the operation's success. Intelligence officers examined aerial reconnaissance photos taken at 8:00 a.m. on February 15th. The photos showed the damaged barn with its rear wall broken open, the cut wire fences, and German forces searching the surrounding farmland. Radio intercepts confirmed German confusion about how the prisoners escaped. One transmission mentioned possible tunnel before being corrected. The operation's results were precisely documented. 8 prisoners rescued. 0 American casualties during the extraction. 1 German soldier killed. 2 wounded in the compound action. 1 German dog handler killed during the pursuit. Material cost: 2 magazines of ammunition, 1 wool jacket, 1 set of wire cutters, and a knife. Time elapsed from infiltration to extraction: 9 hours and 22 minutes. Distance covered: approximately 1,400 yards round trip. Operational success rate: 100%. Colonel Matthews filed a recommendation for the Distinguished Service Cross on February 17th. The citation read, "Private First Class, Daniel Mercer displayed extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy. Acting entirely alone and without support, Private Mercer infiltrated enemy territory, penetrated a fortified compound, and successfully extracted 8 American prisoners scheduled for execution. His actions demonstrated exceptional courage, innovative tactical thinking, and complete disregard for personal safety. Private Mercer's heroism reflects the highest traditions of military service." The award was approved on March 3, 1945. General Courtney Hodges presented the Distinguished Service Cross to Mercer at a ceremony at 1st Army Headquarters in Spa, Belgium. All 8 rescued prisoners attended the ceremony. Henderson spoke briefly, saying, "Danny Mercer saved our lives, using skills he learned crawling through coal mines in Pennsylvania. He came for us when the Army said we couldn't be saved. We're alive because he wouldn't accept impossible." The 8 former prisoners returned to duty in stages. Henderson recovered fully and rejoined the 101st Airborne in March. He participated in Operation Varsity, the Rhine crossing. Ortiz and Morrison returned to their units in April. Flynn, Williams, and Chen received medical discharges due to complications from malnutrition and exposure. Davies and Sullivan completed the war with rear echelon assignments due to their injuries. The rescue mission influenced subsequent operations. Battalion planners studied Mercer's approach technique and wire crossing methods. Combat engineers received updated training on silent infiltration tactics. At least 3 similar rescue operations were attempted in March and April 1945, using variations of Mercer's methods. 2 succeeded. One failed when trip wires were detected differently than Mercer had encountered. The overall rescue success rate in the sector improved from 0% to 67%. German forces implemented countermeasures after Mercer's raid. They increased guard patrols at POW compounds. They replaced damaged wire obstacles with new installations. They added internal guards inside prisoner housing. But the fundamental lesson had been demonstrated. Even fortified positions could be penetrated by individual soldiers with specialized skills and sufficient determination. Daniel Mercer survived the war. He participated in the crossing of the Rhine in March 1945 and the final push into Germany in April. He was present when American and Soviet forces met at the Elbe River on April 25th. He returned to the United States in August 1945 aboard a troop ship from Le Havre. The Distinguished Service Cross was in his duffel bag, along with 2 bronze stars he'd earned for separate actions and a Purple Heart for the frostbite damage to his fingers. Mercer returned to Johnstown, Pennsylvania in September 1945. He went back to work in the Laurel Run mine the following month. He rarely spoke about the war. His family knew he'd earned decorations, but didn't know details. His mother kept the Distinguished Service Cross in a box on her mantel. Mercer kept working the mine tunnels, crawling through 3-foot passages to reach coal seams, using the same skills that had saved 8 men in Belgium. In 1947, Mercer married Elizabeth Crawford, a teacher from Johnstown. They had 3 children. He continued mining until 1963, when automation eliminated the need for workers in tight passages. He became a shift supervisor, training younger miners in safety procedures and navigation techniques. His personnel file noted he had an exceptional safety record, 0 serious accidents in 28 years of mining work. Henderson visited Mercer in Johnstown in 1947, 1952, and 1958. They maintained correspondence throughout their lives. Henderson became an engineer after the war, working for Ford Motor Company in Detroit. He named his second son Daniel. In a 1956 letter to Mercer, Henderson wrote, "I think about that night every February 14th. Every Valentine's Day, I'm reminded that you gave me back my life. I've tried to make it count for something." The 8 rescued prisoners reunited annually from 1946 through 1987. They met in different cities: Detroit, Chicago, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia. Mercer attended every reunion. The group called themselves the February 15th Club, referencing the day they didn't die. They shared meals, told stories, and maintained the bonds forged in that German compound. As the years passed, the group diminished. Williams died in 1974 from heart disease. Flynn died in 1981 from complications of his old wound. Chen passed in 1985. Mercer died on November 3, 1991 in Johnstown, Pennsylvania. He was 71 years old. The cause of death was emphysema, a legacy of 46 years breathing coal dust. Henderson, Ortiz, Morrison, and Sullivan attended the funeral. Military honors included a flag-draped coffin and a 3-volley salute. The 4 surviving members of the February 15th Club served as pallbearers. Henderson spoke at the service, saying, "Danny Mercer was the bravest man I ever knew. He risked everything to save 8 men who were already written off as dead. He succeeded through skill, courage, and the kind of stubborn determination that won't quit even when quitting makes sense." The Distinguished Service Cross was buried with Mercer, pinned inside his coffin at his family's request. The citation accompanied him. His gravestone in Grandview Cemetery includes his name, dates of service, and the notation DSC, Belgium, 1945. Visitors to the cemetery occasionally leave flowers on his grave, though fewer people remember the story as decades pass. The 4 remaining February 15th club members continued their reunions until 2003, when Morrison died. Henderson passed in 2007. Ortiz in 2011. Sullivan, the last survivor of the 8 rescued prisoners, died in 2015 at age 92. Before his death, Sullivan gave an interview to a local newspaper about the rescue. He said, "People ask if I was scared that night in the compound. Of course I was scared. We were all scared. But then Danny Mercer appeared at that foundation gap and whispered that he was getting us out, and I wasn't scared anymore. I was just grateful that someone like him existed." Military historians who study escape and evasion operations consider Mercer's mission a textbook example of individual initiative overcoming institutional limitations. The standard analysis notes that formal rescue protocols failed because they required resources and support that would compromise stealth. Mercer succeeded because he approached the problem with mining techniques rather than military doctrine. He used skills learned in civilian occupation, adapted them to a military context, and executed a plan that required precision, patience, and physical endurance most soldiers couldn't match. The rescue influenced how the Army trained combat engineers in the Korean and Vietnam Wars. Infiltration techniques and silent movement protocols incorporated lessons from Mercer's approach. The concept of using civilian skills in military contexts became part of Special Forces selection criteria. Modern military analysis of the operation focuses on Mercer's ability to recognize that frozen ground required mining techniques rather than infantry tactics. 8 men who should have died on February 15, 1945, lived full lives instead. They raised families, built careers, and contributed to their communities for decades. Their combined lifespans totaled 432 additional years beyond the execution that never occurred. 63 children and grandchildren exist because Daniel Mercer wouldn't accept that his friend Tommy Henderson was already dead. That's the mathematics of courage. 8 lives saved, multiplied across generations, creating a legacy that extends far beyond one freezing night in Belgium. If you found this story compelling, please like this video. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Thank you for keeping these stories alive.